Time, the thing that's passing by right now. And yes, I'm aware that I'm not actually wearing a watch. Time and fiction have a sort of funny relationship. Rarely does a piece of fiction, whether it's a novel or a movie or anything else, take the same amount of time to consume as the story takes to take place. When you get right down to it, the actual length of a story, like how many words it is, doesn't actually correlate all that much to how much time actually passes in the story. An 80,000 word novel could take place over 100 minutes or 100 years. This flexibility when it comes to time creates some challenges but also some opportunities. Like anything else in fiction, the passage of time needs to be carefully managed because ultimately the reader is only getting a sense of how much time is passing. If that sense is not what you intended, you can run into problems. You can say that 1,000 years has passed, but if it doesn't feel to the reader like 1,000 years has passed, then that's a problem. So to help you avoid that, here are 3 tips for managing time in your novel. Tip number 1, be careful with how and when you present time skips. Technically, all you need to do to have 1,000 years pass in your novel is to say that 1,000 years passed in your novel. While this works and allows you to pass an almost infinite amount of time in a single sentence, it can get problematic quite quickly. First off, it's kind of a shock to be reading along and then have 1,000 years pass in one sentence. It automatically means that almost every character we've been reading about has changed or gone away entirely. Unless the story is brought to a sort of conclusive point or something happens that validates the time skip, like all the characters going into a stasis chamber or something, then this type of time skip is going to be a problem. It's best to manage large leaps forward in time like this in either a separate chapter or in a separate part of the book. The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett takes place over several decades, and there are several large time skips on the order of like 20 years, I think, in places. But these are all separated out by different parts of the novel, so it isn't quite as shocking. If you're going to be doing a lot of time skips in your novel, it's best to show at least one fairly early on. That way it becomes established that this is something that happens in the novel, and the reader can become accustomed to it, because every time it happens, they'll have a flashback to the first time that it happened. Speaking of, tip number 2, use flashbacks and other non-linear time elements to your advantage. One of the advantages that fictional time has over real time is that it's not necessarily linear. Okay, well, there's potential that real time could potentially not be linear, but let's just park that for now. Now, most novels don't stray too far from linear time, and if you do, it's likely to be a major selling point of the novel, so you're going to have to put some extra attention to it. That being said, having flashbacks in an otherwise linear novel is not that uncommon. I did a video a while ago on how to use flashbacks effectively, so you can go look at that if you want to get some more information, but here are a few things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that it's clear to the reader that we've moved into a flashback. The transition to the flashback needs to be clear and not too abrupt. Just like with time jumps ahead, a flashback naturally pulls the reader out of the story at the place and time that they've been reading about and moves them somewhere else. This can be problematic because, theoretically at least, the reader was invested in where they were before and now they're being moved somewhere else. You can mitigate this by making the flashback relevant to what's happening in the story at the moment of transition. Ideally, it would answer a question that the reader is asking at that very moment. This way, when you move into the flashback, the reader is interested in it because what's happening in the flashback is relevant to the other parts of the story that they've become invested in. Flashbacks are also a great way to slow the passage of time. This is a common mechanism used in novels that take place over a really short period of time. While the main story thread might take a few days or even a few hours, flashbacks can extend that by breaking from the main thread to show the reader something else. Although, wouldn't that technically mean that the story is taking longer? And wouldn't, when you transition out of the flashback, wouldn't that just be a time skip? You know what? Never mind. Another technique in the non-linear writing technique box is the parallel scene. I don't know if there's a technical name for this, but it's when you have a scene from one character's perspective that happens over a certain length of time or a certain period, and then in the next scene you jump to another character's viewpoint who is doing something at the same time that that other character was doing. They may or may not interact with the first character. They might be somewhere completely different. I'm calling this non-linear because you're basically showing a scene from one character and then moving back in time to show a different scene that takes place over the same time from another character's perspective. The main challenge with these sort of parallel scenes is you need to make it clear to the audience that the next scene is sort of starting at the same point that the last scene started. Regardless of what nonlinear element you're using, something that's very important to remember is not to use flashbacks or time skips just to make the story longer. Tip number 3, don't use flashbacks and time skips just to make the story longer. I said that already. Anytime you mess with time, you should make sure it serves the purposes of your story and that you don't create any dangerous paradoxes or something. I mentioned a couple weeks ago when we talked about lengthening and shortening a novel that stories often have a natural length that they will fit into. And while there are ways to make them longer, that won't necessarily make them better. This is especially true when it comes to jumping forward in time. If a story is too long and you feel you need to move forward in time faster in order to get through it, that might mean you've started the story too early, too far ahead of the exciting parts. If, on the other hand, you feel you need to go back in time by adding flashbacks in order to buff up the length of your story, that might mean you've started too far ahead, perhaps past events that the reader would want to know about. What I'm saying here is that if you're going to make time jumps in either direction, either forward or backwards in a flashback, you want to make sure that it's part of your story that fits. Just like I hope this video fit into your schedule because you sat here and watched it. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday and occasionally on Friday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.